Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those who don't know who I am Wale Balogun, part of a terrific wealth planning team. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Our goal is to provide you with useful information whilst being cognitive of your time. Today, we'll be talking about Debt 101. This is an essential part of the wealth management process, and hence the emphasis on it. Now, one of the things we are quite particular about would be, yeah, wealth for generations. We believe it means knowledge for generations, and we're committed to the 101 series. The reason why we pay this much attention to this is intergenerational wealth transfer is something we believe is important. And today I have Trevor, who is a Gen Xer, and Joel, millennial. So you will be hearing two perspectives. With that being said, I'll hand you over to Trevor.
Thank you very much, Wally. So today what we want to share with you is what we would call the thought process behind it and how different it's been over the last um, maybe few years and generations. We're going to do a little bit of a history of debt, which is kind of fun. It's my old major, so that's what you get from it. I want to start actually going back probably almost 5,000 years, depending on how old Proverbs is. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is the slave to the lender. I just want you to think about that for a moment. Slave to the lender. The language is that deliberate for a reason. It really is a challenge. If you don't, if you're not really cautious about how you get into debt and how you accumulate debt, you can get into a lot of trouble. I know over the years in terms of stories, and I'm sure you've had friends, hopefully friends, not yourself, who really have gotten sidetracked with debt and really looking at it. So, what we want to talk about today is not just the history, but how to look at debt a little bit differently so that you're not going to be sidetracked. What we find most people look at debt is cash flow. That's where people start. Okay, I've got this much money coming in, I've got this much income, this expenses. I can afford to take on more debt as long as my net monthly cash flow is slightly positive, even if it's a dollar. Well, that's an interesting way to see debt, and it can certainly get you in problems. Is all of a sudden you have a $300 weekly car payment, and then you have, a $500 RV payment, and then you've got a $3,000 mortgage. It all seems very affordable, but you're not really looking at the cost of debt. So rather than look at it from exclusively a cash flow perspective, which is one way, what we don't really like to encourage is, I think a better understanding of debt would be how does it affect your net worth? And that is the really simple, what are your assets? In other words, what do you own? And liabilities, what do you owe? And especially as we take on debt sometimes for assets that are going to depreciate over time, I'll tell you some stories of the mistakes I've made in just a few minutes in this presentation. You can really appreciate that looking at it from this perspective, in addition to cash flow, I think is going to help keep you out of trouble in terms of the debt piece and really make you much more aware of when is it safe to take on debt and when isn't it. I think, interestingly enough, Canada hasn't been a debt country for a very long time. Really, recent history would say that we started to take on debt. And I wanted to bring Joel on to start talking about Canada and Canada's history with debt. Sometimes many of these before he was born. Yeah, thanks for the introduction and overview there, Trevor. So mortgages. When did mortgages first become common in Canada? It's actually not until post-World War, World War II. The creation of the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, was in 1945. Now, what was it prior to that? Prior to that, it was mostly homesteaders who built their own home. Their family had been there for generations. And this was the silent generation or post-depression. And
they came up with the concept of mortgages in Canada. Like it's not that they weren't there before, but they weren't common at all. And it was veterans coming home from the war being able to buy a home. So even more recent history is credit cards. Now, this is about my parents' generation, baby boomers, Generation X. And Canada's first credit card was the Charge X. Didn't come out till 1968. So Trevor was telling me a story earlier that was quite comical, where he was with his mom at the grocery store and she was still paying for groceries with checks. Now, almost everybody has a credit card now, but it's just interesting to see that it hasn't been here forever. Now, go forward about 25, 30 years, and now we've got the line of credit, which is very, very common now. Almost everyone needs to have some form of it, whether it would be a home equity line of credit that's tied to your home or an all-in-one, or just a line of credit, a personal line of credit. Now, this came out in the millennial time frame generation, which is my walk of life, so to speak. Um, but it's not something that's been around very long. Like 1995-ish is about when it became a prominent part of the Canadian financial landscape. So just interesting to see that, these we always think about it like it's been here forever, and it definitely hasn't. Something we need to be cognizant of and accumulate and respectively, and also just make sure we're thinking about it and how it affects our financial plan.
Oh, you like my card?
I do.
I thought I'd give you a nice view of my first car loan. So back in 1998, shortly after buying a house, I thought I needed a brand new car. This is a 1998 black Stratus, almost exactly the vehicle we had. It's a beauty, isn't it? And what did I look at? I looked at, could I afford the monthly car payments? That's exactly what I looked at. I looked at the 5 year and I said, oh, yes, I can afford this. And I had a mortgage at the time, plus other commitments, which all started to add up and give me stress. But I want to share this with you because it doesn't mean that you have to be perfect on debt. You can never have a car loan. You can never have taken any debt on. It just means I wish there'd been some warnings. What do I mean by warnings? When I look at this, what does debt really cost? Remember, not just the cash flow. Now, my car certainly wasn't $66,000. You'll be happy to know. You think, oh, that guy ever gets stolen from. That is the average cost, though, of a new car in Canada today, right around $66,000. I've been sharing that with clients as they go out car hunting because many of them haven't purchased a car in over a decade. And they're kind of falling off their chairs a little bit when they say, holy smokes, is that expensive? Moreover, now we have 8 year car payments are very common. So all of a sudden, we have a $66,000 vehicle over 8 years. And we look often at, can I afford the $964 a month or $250 bi-weekly or however, or weekly, sorry, however we do it. But at the end of 8 years, what do we have? We have a vehicle we paid $66,000 for, plus $14,000 in interest. And a vehicle on average in Canada in terms of depreciation, 66,000 would be worth about 23 at the end of 8 years. That is a really different definition of debt when you look at it. To pay on a depreciation asset, which I've done, as I've said a few times in terms of car loans, is something that I question a little bit more diligently today. Should I have, in fact, saved up the dollars to pay for that versus to go in debt for a car? Now, what typically makes sense, though, is what we have almost no question about going into debt for is a home purchase. Ironically, my house is actually the one with the tree in front. That's 51 Harvest Oak Circle. It was the first home that we bought way back in 1998. And like most people, we got into like the maximum amount of mortgage that we could afford at the time, monthly payments and everything else. We didn't think at all about what the costs would be long term. And I think this is really important because the costs of home in Canada, we always hear that they're very high. And I think we need to just really consider what type of home can we actually afford, not just from a monthly payment, but over time. This is a very busy slide because I looked at a couple different things, but average home, we typically spread it over 25 years. Again, oftentimes we look at can I afford the monthly payment? But on the average home in Canada right now being worth about $650,000, at current interest rates, we actually pay almost $500,000 worth of interest. So when people say our home's worth it, well, you'll have paid for this home over 25 years, 1.1 million. for a $650,000 home. Maybe that will give you pause about, as Joel said, we often call this a good debt, but he says to clients, I think it's more of a necessary debt. It's very difficult to save up $650,000 just to purchase a home, knowing that homes go up over time. But it really should give us pause to say, well, what really makes sense? The other piece of this is that over 5 years, the first 5 years of a mortgage, we typically don't pay that much money down. So in this case, the reason I put this out is answering a question that we get an awful lot, and I'll answer that a little bit later. But really, in this first 5 years, even though you make over $250,000 of payments, you actually only pay $74,000 down principal. So there is still a net balance. Now, homes, unlike cars, have typically gone up specifically over time. So it definitely puts a little bit less pressure, I think, on home ownership. We want to be respectful of time, and we also want to give you a strategy. Specifically on the home piece. On the car piece, we would say as much as you can, look at paying cash for a vehicle, even if it's not quite the vehicle that you might have wanted, until you can pay cash for the vehicles you want. But on homes, it's very interesting. You can pay your home back relatively quickly just by really looking at when the renewals come up. So we call it the 25-year amortization, the 5-year renewal, and being able to pay for it in 15 years. How would you do that? Typically, we in Canada, Canadians typically take 5-year rates, whether that's a 5-year variable or a 5-year fixed. That is the common loan term in Canada in terms of mortgage. When that 5-year comes up, you start with 25 minus 5. It would be logical to take that down to 20 years. But what if you took it down to 15 instead? What you notice, even on that 650 house, is actually your payments don't go up a whole heck of a lot, depending on what's happened with interest rates. And then the next 5 years, what if you minus 15 from 5, you'd be 10, but what if you took it down to 5 instead? The payments go up a little bit more on this case, but what's interesting is in a relatively long period of time, 15 years is still a long period of time, you can have a home paid and you'll have paid $200,000 less of interest. That's great. But you'll also have a home that's rent-free for over 10 more years. You'll be done after 15 years. Now, I wish I would have had that strategy introduced to me. I took about 19 years to pay off our home. So it wasn't necessarily as quick, but it is possible. And I can tell you, looking at the other end, this really does make a difference in terms of how you feel and what's stressing you out in your life or not if you are able to get a mortgage done rent-free. Debt 101. You've heard this from your grandparents, likely from your parents, and if you've got some aunts and uncles who care from you, they've told you this too. Sometimes you have to save for things. I know my nephew will tell you, he really wanted that nice red car, and it's lovely. I just was driving it this weekend. And he should have probably saved for it versus taking the car payments for it. Some of these lessons we can learn ourselves, but especially for something like recreation vehicles and bigger car payments, which car payments are getting into that realm, delayed gratification can be a much better friend. We're going to suggest, if you haven't watched our Finance 101 series, go back to it. Because the other thing that's really critical about debt is having a savings habit at the same time. Joel is going to talk about that in a moment. Really, I love this quote because a savings makes an inconvenience. I didn't expect to pay for new tires. I didn't expect to pay for new windows in the house. If you have a savings account, it turns it from a crisis into an inconvenience. It's not maybe where you want to spend your money. And also, equally important, make sure you stay out of debt. That's the critical message that we really want to instill in you today. Is debt's going to happen throughout your life. You don't have to be perfect with it. I certainly haven't been. At the same time, if you can find ways to not just pay off debt, but stay out of debt going forward, you're going to be the envy of friends and you're going to have your own much happier life and lifestyle for that reason. Our next 101's coming up. I'll turn that back to Joel.
Well, thanks, Trevor. So as Wally and Trevor both said, we've been very diligent in trying to ensure that we're educating our clients as much as possible, which is why we've done this 101 series. And earlier in the year, we talked about tariffs, we did Finance 101, now we're doing Debt 101. In the coming months here, we're actually going to have 3 more seminars: Estate 101, Insurance 101, and Investment 101. The goal here is to make sure that we're covering all 6 pillars of financial planning, which is going to be cash management, risk management, investment planning, estate planning, retirement planning, and also tax planning. And each one of these pieces is very crucial to the value of a holistic financial plan and ensuring that everything works out. Um, so without further ado, we're going to move on to some questions now, I believe.
We are. I'm just going to stop recording.